Today on Star Trek Revisited, we are going to recap quite possibly one of the worst ever episodes of Star Trek, the original series. It's from season 1, it's called The Alternative Factor, and without any further ado, let's get right into it. As this episode begins, the Enterprise is in orbit over a planet and they are conducting a survey, and Spock is at the science station deep in concentration, and he turns around and reports to Kirk that it's iron, silicon base, oxygen, hydrogen atmosphere, largely arid and no discernible life, which is an important piece of information at the very start of the episode. Kirk orders the cartographic section to begin scanning, and this may be the first reference we get in Star Trek to cartography, or stellar cartography as it would later become to be known. And he then orders Mr. Leslie, who is sat at helm duty today, to do 4 more orbits. That should about do it, Mr. Leslie. I don't know who the guy sitting at navigation is next to Leslie this week. He is new to me, a new face that I've not seen before. Uhura is, as ever, on duty at communications. And then after those 4 orbits, Kirk says, lay in a course for Starbase 200. Now that, I believe, is the highest Starbase number I've heard, certainly in the original series. We may have heard higher numbered Starbases in later iterations of Trek, but certainly in these early ones, we wouldn't venture higher than probably 11 or 12, as far as I can recall. Now, as Kirk gives this order, something weird happens on the Enterprise. There is this effect, this shimmering in and out of existence type effect, which immediately disturbs everybody on the ship, and they lean over and they're the usual sort of thing. And we can see an almost transparent effect overlaying the Enterprise as if they are passing through every piece of the universe all at once. It ends after a few moments, and Kirk questions Mr. Spock, what was that? And Spock simply responds, incredible, Captain. Before he can get a sentence out, it starts again and comes to an end in a similar way. Kirk then runs over to Spock and says, what was that? And Spock says, well, twice for a split second each time. Everything within instrument range seemed to simply be on the verge of winking out. Kirk's not happy with this explanation. He says, I want facts, not poetry. And Spock says, I have given you the facts, Captain. The entire magnetic field in this solar system simply blinked. At this point, Uhura chips in and says, standard general alert signal from Starfleet Command, Captain. And Spock follows up with a mention that Captain scanners now report a life object on the planet's surface below. And you'll recall that we were showing no discernible signs of life just a few moments ago. And Kirk says this, you did a complete life survey 5 minutes ago. How is it you're just picking it up now? But indeed, although Spock has no explanation for this, he's picking up a living being, apparently human, and its appearance coincided with this cosmic winking out effect to almost the second. Kirk and Spock decide that they are going to check this out with a landing party, and they will beam down accompanied by a security team, which Uhura signals to be ready. Kirk meanwhile wants Uhura to relay anything further from Starfleet Command down to the planet. And so ends our teaser, and quite an eventful one it was too. The opening credits complete, and we get our episode title, which is The Alternative Factor, which is shown over a outdoor environment, and if I'm not very much mistaken again, I think we're probably filming in Vasquez Rocks once again. But wherever it may be, it's always very nice to see our crew, our actors, out and about in real life locations rather than on plastic rock studio sets. I mean, I don't mind a bit of both. The plastic rock sets do give that more alien world feel, even if they aren't that realistic. But hey, who's to say what alien worlds actually do look like? They might look plastic rocky for all we know. But our landing party beams down. Kirk's doing a log as the landing party materializes, explaining that the Enterprise has been subjected to violent and unexplained stress and force. We have a landing party of Kirk and Spock and 4 security officers. One of those security officers I recognize as Billy Blackburn, playing Mr. Hadley, this time dressed in red rather than his usual yellow that he normally wears. I don't immediately or particularly recognize any of the other security officers who are in the party. They quickly, as they explore, come across what appears to be a crashed spaceship, a very primitive-looking small flying saucer-type spacecraft, which is on the surface of this deserty, rocky terrain. And they approach it, and just as they're getting near, they hear a scream from behind them, up above on the rocks. A voice says, "You came! It's not too late!" And this very strange figure appears. This man with literally the oddest beard I've ever seen says he's in a state of distress, and he says, "We can still stop him." And Kirk and Spock and party look up quite bemused at this sight. And the fella promptly falls over for what's going to be the first of a few times he falls over in this episode. And they rush to him, and the mystery deepens. And they see this fella on the ground, unconscious now. We cut back to the Enterprise, and Kirk enters the bridge, and we get our first appearance of Lieutenant Masters. This is a young female officer dressed in blue, who rather bizarrely and strangely will turn out to be the chief engineer, or a senior engineer in this episode at least. We've got no Scotty, and we have this lady who is the senior engineer present for this episode. Now, number one, what I find strange is the fact that if she's in the engineering division, why is she wearing blue? Number two, she is a lieutenant, but she doesn't have any stripes on her uniform. Unlike Lieutenant Uhura, who Kirk walks past, and she reports to him, "Nothing yet, sir," from Starfleet Command. And you can clearly see that Uhura does have the lieutenant stripes on her own red uniform. Masters comes over to Kirk as he steps down to his command chair, and she says, "Report on the dilithium crystals, Captain." And she relays that they have been affected by the disturbance, the effect, the winking out that just occurred. And she has a talent for understatement here, because she says to Kirk it could cause trouble, and Kirk says, "That is an understatement, Lieutenant. Without full crystal power, our orbit will begin to decay in 10 hours. And he orders her to re-amplify the crystals immediately. Now, that's interesting to me, because if you know Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which I'm sure most of you will, in that movie there is a requirement to recrystallize the dilithium crystals. And I won't say any more than that, because we'll get to Star Trek IV in good time. This is an instruction to re-amplify them, and long story short, assuming that they are similar or the same thing, then Scotty tells Kirk in Star Trek IV that there's no way of recrystallizing dilithium. So who knows? Maybe just re-amplifying and recrystallizing is a different thing. Kirk goes over to Spock and asks, has there been any further magnetic disturbance? And Spock relay scanners indicate the situation is normal. But he relays also that the phenomenon they encountered was unquestionably widespread, and it was strongest here on this planet. And at that moment, Uhura gets the signal from Starfleet Command that they've been waiting for, and she says, "Red 2 message in 1 minute, Captain. Starfleet Command." And she says, "Code Factor 1, sir," which apparently is a big deal because Kirk gets her to repeat. "Code Factor 1, she confirms, and Kirk relays invasion status. And a few moments later, the view screen engages, Starfleet are ready to communicate, and Kirk says, "Enterprise standing by, Commodore." And we get a visual on the screen of a senior flag officer at Starfleet Command, and this is Commodore Barstow, who would go on to play another Starfleet flag officer later on in the series, an admiral on this case. I can't recall at this moment if it's Comac or Fitzgerald or Fitzpatrick, but we'll try and remember to confirm that on IMDb at the end of the episode. But Commodore Barstow here relays to them, "You're aware of the effect an hour ago," to which Kirk obviously says, "Of course, yes, sir." Barstow relays that they may not be aware of the phenomenon's scope, and that it actually occurred widespread as Spock had theorized, but not only that, it occurred in every quadrant of the galaxy and far beyond. The question that they have at this moment is, are these natural phenomenon, or are they mechanically created? And Kirk says, "I've considered the alternatives available to me at this point, and at the moment my best guess is it could be a prelude to invasion." And Barstow concurs, exactly our consensus. Barstow informs them that they've drawn the short straw of investigating this phenomenon. Kirk asks, "Can you assign me other starships as a reserve?" Barstow says, "Negative. I'm evacuating all Starfleet units and personnel within 100 parsecs of your position. This is going to be tough on you in the Enterprise, but it is what it is. You're on your own." And Kirk says, "Well, you mean we're the bait?" And Barstow simply says, "Good luck." And the transmission ends. Spock then comes over to Kirk and they debate some more and says, first, the phenomenon came from the planet below. Secondly, the danger is apparently real and imminent. Third, a closer examination of the planet's surface, therefore, is clearly in order. And Kirk agrees and says, you go, Spock, I'll go and talk to our unexpected guest. And we cut to a scene in, strangely, Kirk's quarters. I don't quite understand why he's talking to this guy in Kirk's quarters. And our guest, who turns out to be called Lazarus, relays to Kirk a story of, that's how I came to be down there, Captain. Pursuing the devil's own spawn, a thing I've chased across the universe. He's humanoid outside, but inside he's a hideous murdering monster. And Kirk goes on to probe him for information. And he asks, that thing had destroyed your entire civilization? How did you manage to avoid it? The obvious question. And Lazarus responds somewhat indignantly that I was inspecting magnetic communication satellites, and he's clearly a very disturbed individual, this Lazarus. He gets very, very upset when he feels that he's not being listened to or taken seriously with his clear fear and hatred of whatever it is that he's engaged in pursuit of here. And he goes as far as saying he's death, anti-life, in a very animated fashion. And a funny little story here, actually, a bit of my own personal trivia. When I first saw this episode as a young person, I misheard that line. I thought Lazarus said, he's death and he life. And I thought, that's a funny thing to say, but it makes much more sense that it's he's death, anti-life. Kirk, as ever, says, my only cause is the safety of my ship. And he ponders for a moment, but then says to Lazarus, you'll beam down with me and I'll check your story out. When we cut to the planet's surface, where Spock is leading our security officers in an investigation around the flying saucer craft of that is down on the surface there. And Kirk relays to Spock that, according to Lazarus, there's a creature on this planet. And Spock says, I suggest, Captain, you've been lied to. There is no evidence of that at all. And Lazarus, again, gets very defensive here and says, well, why do you give credence to this man? And Spock just responds in a brilliant way that only Spock could, to be honest. And he says, I have simply made the logical deduction that you are a liar. And the way he delivers this line is absolute Leonard Nimoy perfection. Kirk just obviously has trust in his first officer, which I like. This is a thumbs up for Kirk here, and we'll get to a thumbs down equivalent of this in the episode not too long from now. He trusts Spock and he says, well, let's have it, the truth this time. And just as he asks this winking out phenomenon happens again, and it seems to affect Lazarus more than anyone else. And we get this strange swirly effect, is the only way I can describe it. And Kirk shouts, Lazarus! And Lazarus starts running, and he appears in this tunnel or corridor where he seems to engage and start fighting with another figure. And this lasts for a minute maybe, and it ends, and Lazarus comes out of it. And once again, he falls to the ground, and Kirk goes over to him. And Lazarus relays to Kirk, the thing had attacked me. Spock comes across and says, Captain, the readings of the effect indicate it's centered here on this planet, almost on this very spot. Kirk then says, let's get back to the ship. Lazarus isn't happy with this at all. And he says, no, he'll kill us all if we don't kill him first. Kill. And he goes absolutely bananas here, and mouth wide open in the shot. You can pretty much see his fillings there if you look closely. Anyway, we're back up on the Enterprise now as Kirk delivers the captain's log, stardate 3088.3. That's something I've never mentioned to this date, actually. The stardates, apparently Gene Roddenberry claimed that they made sense in some way, shape, or form, and he was also known to just dismiss them and say, don't worry about it, it doesn't matter. But if you watch it in not only broadcast order, which I never do because I think that's a sucky way to watch Star Trek, even if you watch it in production order, as I do and I'm doing here, the star dates aren't consecutive. They don't follow on from each other. They're just whatever numbers are made up for the most part, to be honest. They don't connect at all. But anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. We cut to sickbay, and as Kirk records his log, he relays, as for Lazarus, the story he tells me about the humanoid continues to trouble me. But what if it's true? And up on the bridge, Spock and Kirk continue this discussion, and Kirk says, if there's a shred of truth to what Lazarus said, that a single creature, a humanoid, could be responsible for an effect of such magnitude, hard to believe, Spock confirms. But the rest of his story seems to fit. His wounds testify to an apparent confrontation. Spock chimes in, Captain, I only know for certain that the occurrence of the phenomenon coincides exactly with the moments that Lazarus has his alleged confrontations. Meanwhile, we get a message from Uhura over at Kirk's chair saying, Dr. McCoy is asking to see you in sickbay, Captain. And we cut promptly down to sickbay where Kirk has arrived. And McCoy is pondering. He says, I don't know, Jim. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I'm not. Well, as you know, I brought Lazarus in here. We both brought him in here. And I treated a deep abrasion on his forehead, right? And I bandaged it. And then I stepped into this room just for a moment, but when I returned, there wasn't a trace of that wound on his forehead. And Kirk looks puzzled at McCoy as we cut to the rec room where Lazarus is sat quite calmly now, enjoying a cup of coffee. And we get various people in the rec room. We have a female crew member in yellow and another one in blue. And we've got another female in blue and a crewman in a blue coveralls playing tridimensional chess. And this scene here amuses me greatly, actually. The lady who's getting a coffee from the replicator, she walks over to join Lieutenant Masters, who's sat working on some sort of computer device in the rec room. And Lieutenant Brent is there in the rec room. And the look he gives this lady is, he gives her the biggest smile. I don't know if what the purpose of that acting choice was, or whether he's checking her out, or but he's very happy to see this lady as she sits down next to Lieutenant Masters, and in walks an engineering officer, finally, unnamed. We don't get this guy's name, but he is Lieutenant Masters' assistant. Yet he has the lieutenant stripes on. He has the correct color red of engineering, whereas she does not, as we've already established. And she greets him and says, hi, coffee. And he then says, oh, is that an order, Lieutenant? Even though she doesn't have those stripes on. And then he relays to her that the reamplification of the dilithium crystals is finished. And ping, Lazarus comes on like a light bulb. Something is flickered in his head when he hears the mention of dilithium crystals. And off go Masters and the other officer, and Lazarus follows them out of the rec room. And I don't know what it is about this lady in blue, but Lazarus checks her out as well, and Brent gives him a bit of a smile. Has this lady got some sort of special allure or scent that's driving men wild? I don't know, but it's an interesting little scene. She's an attractive young lady for sure, but it's an interesting acting choice from the director of this episode. Anyway, Lazarus exits the room and he sort of gets his bearings, looks around, and note at this point that he does not have, as McCoy stated, he does not have a bandage on his forehead or any sort of bruise or marking on his forehead, as the effect clicks in again and we get this winking out. Now, I don't know if this particular winking out was recorded on the bridge, because there's nothing is mentioned in relation to it at this point, but I'm going to assume that it was recorded again, because it was felt all across the universe, as we know. It ends again, and Lazarus comes out of it, and the bandage on his forehead has reappeared just as Kirk and McCoy exit the turbo lift, see him looking uncomfortable, and they rush to him and says, Lazarus, everything okay? And McCoy looks at him confused when he sees the bandage on his head, and he actually rips the bandage off in surprise, and we see that there is that cut, that mark there on his forehead, as originally was seen when they first encountered him. And McCoy looks absolutely stunned, and Lazarus addresses him and says, something wrong? And Kirk chimes in here, and this is the thumbs down I was telling you about. He says, no, I just have a ship's physician with a strange sense of humor. And McCoy says, no, this is no joke, Jim. And what I don't like about this is that Kirk should know better that McCoy would not joke about something as serious as this. Why would he? McCoy's got a sense of humor, sure, but why would he say something like that? And why would Kirk not believe him? Why would Kirk think it's a joke? So, no, that doesn't work for me. As McCoy defends and says, I know what I saw. Spock then calls from the bridge and requests Kirk's presence up there to look at something quite extraordinary. So this may be an acknowledgement of the fact that they did just encounter another disturbance. You would have thought that Kirk and McCoy would have realized and acknowledged it as well, though. Kirk says, Lazarus, you're with me. And again, another thumbs down here. Kirk chastises Bones again and says, Bones, if I had the time, I'd laugh, as Bones looks confused, almost as if starting to doubt himself. On the bridge, Spock orders Uhura to have the main screen on, Lieutenant, in preparation for the captain's arrival, and arrive they do. And Spock relays to Kirk that on the planet's surface, a source of radiation, Captain. And we get on the monitor a shimmering effect which shows that source of radiation. And Kirk, as the mystery deepens, says, well, how is it the scanners didn't pick this up before? And Spock says, because it is not there. And Kirk says, another riddle? First Dr. McCoy, then you. And Spock says, I confess I'm at somewhat of a loss for words. It is a rip in our universe. However, with the dilithium crystals, I was able to localize it. And Lazarus, bandage on head Lazarus, that is, because at this point it should be really obvious to anybody watching this episode, even for the first time, that there are two Lazaruses. Only explanation. And this Lazarus says, yes, that's it. The dilithium crystals, their power, we could do it. And Kirk says, you refer to the humanoid? And Lazarus says, yes, we've got him, Captain, we've got him. Kirk says, what do crystals have to do with it? All they show is a point of radiation. And Lazarus says, that's just it. That's the key. That's the way to trap him. Give me the crystals. Kirk says, out of the question. They're the source of power of my ship. And Lazarus says, don't you understand? There won't be any ship if we don't kill him. And Kirk tries to calm Lazarus down. And then he probes again. Now you tell me how. All I've heard from you is double talk, lies, and threats. How does it present a danger to my ship? Lazarus doubles down and says, you'll give me the crystals. Kirk says, don't threaten me, Lazarus. And Lazarus again says, I'll have my vengeance. And off he goes through the corridors and stumbles over again. The effect happens again. And at the end of it, the other Lazarus comes back without the bandage on the head and he's taken his place again. Duh, should be very, very obvious for all to see. Now, this Lazarus is the one who was in the rec room not that long ago, and he heard the mention of dilithium crystals too. So both Lazaruses at this point are aware that dilithium crystals are the key to solving their collective problem. And he goes to engineering. And inside engineering, or what is supposed to pass for engineering in this episode, because it's clearly not the usual engineering set. So not only do we not have our usual engineers, we have a different engineering room as well. So that's a bit weird. And we see the dilithium crystals in their little slots in the wall, and they look different to the last time we saw these in Mudd's Women. Lieutenant Masters is adjusting some controls, and she closes the boxes where the dilithium crystals are stored. In walks her deputy, her unnamed deputy, and he says, Lieutenant Masters, Captain's calling, and off she goes. She answers, and Kirk calls down and says, Lieutenant, can you prepare an experiment chamber for me in 10 minutes? And as this message is getting relayed, Lazarus attacks the deputy and renders him unconscious as Kirk finishes his message, all dilithium crystals full power. Masters says, she'll check, sir. And she goes over and says, Captain, the chamber will be ready. And Lazarus comes in and renders her unconscious too. And Kirk calls down saying, Lieutenant, what is it? What is it? We cut back up to the bridge and Uhura relays that Captain, security reports Lazarus is missing. We get another captain's log, which relays the fact that we are no closer to finding an answer, not only of 2 of my crewmen being attacked, but now 2 of our dilithium crystals are missing. And we cut to the briefing room where there's obviously been another disturbance at this point since we've last heard, because the other Lazarus with the plaster, the bandage on his head, is back again. And 2 of our dilithium crystals are missing. Now, unless I'm missing something very obvious, so is Lazarus's beard missing here. Where's his funny beard gone? Unless it's so transparent that in this lighting we just can't see it. Now, behind him is standing a security officer who I'm sure we've seen this guy before. I'm pretty certain he was the useless security officer who tried to protect the bridge in Dagger of the Mind, and even prepared for that, he was still rendered ineffective by Van Gelder, who crept up behind him back to the turbolift door. Sure, that's the same guy. But anyway, Kirk goes on to explain, without these crystals, the Enterprise cannot operate at full power. And then Kirk challenges Lazarus for the facts. Fact, you said you needed the crystal. Fact, after an hour, you said you must have them. And fact, Captain, says Lazarus, I didn't take the crystals. I'm not the one, as we get a closer-up shot with him, and his little tiny beard is kind of still there, but not as obvious as it was before. Find the beast and you'll find the crystals, Lazarus says. And Kirk says, how did this beast get aboard my ship? He did. Isn't that enough? Lazarus retorts. And Kirk says, no, he didn't transport up. There's an unexplained radiation source on that planet, obviously some connection. We'll go down and check it out. And this up and down of this episode continues. 1 minute they're on the Enterprise, then they're back on the planet, then they're up and down and up and down. And this episode is getting a bit tiresome. It's got a bit of a slow pace, and it's quite repetitive in many ways. And I don't enjoy it for that, I really have to say. But Kirk commits and says, organize a search party immediately. Mr. Lazarus will beam down with us. On the planet, Lazarus challenges Kirk and says, "What do you believe now, Captain?" And Kirk says, "I believe that the missing crystals are not in your ship because they haven't found them in his ship." Spock then confirms that they've been unable to locate the source of the radiation, and Kirk says, "Well, why not? You had it spotted from the Enterprise." And Spock says, "It's simply disappeared, Captain." Kirk then says, "I want every inch of this terrain checked, and don't be afraid to use your weapons," as we see Kirk standing around the craft with Lazarus there, Spock, and Lieutenant Hadley on security duty. And they walk off, and they go exploring to check the terrain, and for some reason, and again, this is a massive down, this guy who is quite clearly a security threat to them, they let him wander off on his own. They don't keep him under observation, and he goes up top on these cliffs, and wandering he goes on his own. So really, really poor tactics and security in this episode. And the effect starts again, and everyone starts getting blown all over the place and trying to retain their balance, and Lazarus is at the top of the cliff, and he realizes that he's going to fall again, and he shouts down and says, "Captain, look out," because he sees Kirk down below, and Kirk moves out of the way just in time as we see Lazarus, or Lazarus' stunt double in this case, fall from the top of the cliff. And this is a really good stunt, I have to say. Hats off to whoever the stunt guy was here, because I imagine he's got a nice soft landing on a mattress or something, but still, cool effort. Love it. And Kirk observes as Lazarus falls to the ground, and there he is, unconscious again. And he rushes over to Lazarus. And now we're back on board the Enterprise, back in sickbay. Lazarus comes to again. He starts to wake up. It's still the Lazarus with the plaster on. We didn't, in that last disturbance on the planet, we didn't change places again this time. And he starts stirring, says, "Oh, the thing." And Kirk first says to him, "You saved my life down there. I want to thank you." And Lazarus says, "Well, why shouldn't I?" But then Kirk ignores that and probes on and says, "I've got some questions I want to ask you." And he says, "I've got a computer report of the evidence you gave. Calls you a liar, Lazarus. For one thing, there's no planet at the location you said that you came from." And I must have either missed something earlier on. In fact, I'm sure I didn't. The very first time we see Kirk speaking to Lazarus in his quarters, he's at the end of relaying his fantastic story about why he was there and where he came from. And we didn't actually hear that. So I think this is the first time we're hearing the fact that Lazarus had explained that he came from another planet. And Kirk says, "I'll have the truth now." And Lazarus obliges. He says, "My planet, my Earth, or what's left of it, is actually down there beneath us. He's actually from that planet. And my spaceship is more than just that. It's a time chamber. And I," in a dramatic fashion here, as the scene closes, "I am a time traveler." And I'm calling bullshit here. He's not a time traveler. He's a dimension jumper. He hops between dimensions. That is not the same thing as time travel. And I think most people know that. So what a stupid thing to say, unless he was lying for a particular reason. And Kirk responds, "And this thing you searched for is a time traveler too?" And Lazarus replies, "Oh yes, he's fled me all across the years. Give me the tools, I need to kill him. Give me the crystals." And he gets all ragey again. And Kirk says, "Lazarus, you've been hurt. I know, I sympathize, but I've got 430 other women on this ship to worry about. Now, where are those crystals?" And Lazarus again says, "I told you, he's got them." And then, again, we're getting to another thumbs down here because McCoy says something. He says, "Well, don't worry, he's not going anywhere." Okay, let's take your word on that for now, McCoy. Not this time, anyway. And literally seconds later, Kirk leaves, McCoy goes out into his office, and Lazarus gets up and promptly walks out. And come on, ridiculous. Where is the security in this episode? Where is the diligence? Unacceptable, quite frankly. We cut to the briefing room where Kirk is with Spock, and we're going over old ground again, so repetitive. They're talking about what they know so far again, what they don't know so far again, and then finally they start to piece things together. And Kirk says, "Lazarus, a walking powder keg, you're rip in the universe." And Spock says, "Not from our universe." And then Kirk retorts, "Then what you say leads obviously to one alternative, that the source of that radiation is not from our universe, nor in our universe," confirms Spock. And then it clicks for them. Another universe, perhaps in another dimension. And Kirk postulates, what would happen if another universe, say a minus universe, came into contact with a positive universe such as ours? "Unquestionably a warp, a distortion of physical laws," says Spock. "What is your analysis," Kirk asks, "of the mental state of Lazarus?" Spock relays, "One moment paranoid, the next calm, mild, rational, almost as if he were two men." Duh. We all worked that out ages ago. "Yes, two men, different but identical," says Kirk, "and a hole in a universe. And not a hole, more of a door." through which these two beings are somehow unable to pass. 1 minute he's at the point of death, the next he's alive. The cut on his forehead, first he has it, then he doesn't. Finally he believes McCoy on this. Quite right. Unquestionably, there are two of him, says Spock. And finally, we got to that ages ago. Jim, says Spock, the madness has no purpose or reason, but it may have a goal. He must be stopped, held, destroyed if necessary. Matter and antimatter, positive or negative, have a tendency to cancel each other out violently. And when two identical particles of matter and antimatter meet, annihilation, Jim. As we cut to Lazarus, the Lazarus who has just absconded without any problem at all from sickbay, plaster on head again, the other Lazarus, the Lazarus who does not have dilithium crystals, he goes to engineering and he creates a distraction with this warning high voltage piece of equipment, which he stuffs a bit of cloth in and starts a bit of a fire, popping and sizzling as the captions say on the screen. Inside engineering, masters and unnamed assistant are working away when suddenly their console starts smoking and they have to evacuate engineering, and they're coughing and spluttering, and they call up to the bridge saying, engineering, calling bridge, fire, fire, and in the background Lazarus has just walked in and out. No evidence of him having to cough or splutter. He had a purpose, and then he went and got some crystals out. Out he came again, and Uhura relays on the bridge to Kirk that fire captain, engineering situation critical. And we cut back down to outside engineering where fire crew is helping the assistant engineer to control the situation. And he relays to Kirk that it is indeed under control, sir, but it couldn't have started by itself. And they immediately realize that this is Lazarus, a trick to get the crystals. And meanwhile, we're in the transporter room where a very wet behind the ears, young, naive-looking transporter technician is there. Sir, you shouldn't be in here. And like, duh, of course not. And he gets no more than he should have expected for being such a doofus. And Lazarus clocks him one, and miraculously he knows how to activate the Enterprise's transporter and transport himself down to wherever he wants to be. So that's a bit of a thumbs down for me as well. How come everybody knows how to operate the Enterprise's transporter? But down he goes. Let's let that go and suspend my disbelief. Kirk then tells Spock, I'm going after him. You organize a security detail and follow me down. On the planet's surface, Lazarus is running towards his ship, crystal in hand, and saying, yes, yes, we can do it now. I've got a threshold. I'll get you now. And Kirk goes into the transport room and orders the wet behind the ears young lad to energize and beam him down. And seconds later, Kirk confronts Lazarus, who is not pleased to see Kirk, and Lazarus is inside his ship, and he's put the crystals in place at this point. And he says, no, don't, not you. And Kirk goes to cross the threshold of between outside and inside the ship and promptly disappears, to which Lazarus reacts, no, not happy about that at all. And then the next scene, Kirk is in the corridor. He's actually in this corridor between dimensions, and he exits onto an identical world, but one that is in darkness. This planet is dark. And actually, major difference here, we are no longer in the actual outdoors. We are in a studio with plastic rocks now. And do you know, after all these years, this is actually the first time that I've ever noticed this difference. The matter universe is outdoors. The antimatter universe is in a set. Interesting. And Kirk goes over to this ship, which looks almost identical to the other universe Lazarus ship. This one doesn't have its globe top on. And here we have calm Lazarus, the one who does not have the plaster on his head, and he sees Kirk and greets him and says, welcome. And they have a conversation, and they chat about the fact that this is a parallel universe, and reinforce the position that if identical particles meet, and Lazarus, good Lazarus that is, says, the end of everything. I tried to stop him, Captain. That's why I took your dilithium crystals. And Kirk says, well, he has 2 more now. And Lazarus says, that's very bad, Captain. If he comes through that corridor at a time of his own choosing, but I think if we hurry, he can yet still be stopped. And then Kirk goes on to press, what exactly did I pass through? And Lazarus says, well, I call it an alternative warp. It's sort of a negative magnetic corridor. And Kirk says, well, this corridor, is it what caused the magnetic effect, the winking out phenomenon? And Lazarus says, precisely, Captain, but not because of its existence, but because my foe entered. Kirk says, challenges, well, he knows about this, he knows about you. And Lazarus says, of course he knows, Captain, but he's mad. When our people found a way to slip through the warp, it was too much for him. He could not live knowing that I lived. He became obsessed with the idea of destroying me. So if we can force him into the corridor while I'm waiting for him, force him through his threshold while I'm waiting for him into the corridor, and I'll hold him there, and then you have to destroy my ship. And then Kirk says, well, wait a minute. If I destroy his ship, won't yours also be destroyed? You'll be trapped in the corridor? And Lazarus says, yes, absolutely. And Kirk says, well, with him forever at each other's throats throughout time? And Lazarus says, is it such a high price to pay for the survival of two universes? And they proceed. They get things ready, and he zaps Kirk through his threshold and sends him back. And Kirk appears back in the Prime Universe or Matter Universe, whatever you want to call it. Spock and security party are there confronting crazy Lazarus, and Kirk appears and starts fighting him and trying to push him towards his ship. He says, no, I'm not ready. And what follows is a ridiculous fight where this doofus of a man gets the better of Kirk almost immediately, probably through his sheer desperation, to be honest. But Kirk eventually gets the upper hand and pushes Lazarus through the threshold, and he disappears into the corridor. And Spock then says, take these crystals to the Enterprise. And Kirk relays, I must destroy that ship completely. And then they say, well, what of Lazarus? And what of Lazarus? And they beam up to the Enterprise. Onto the bridge they go, and yes, massive thumbs up. Leslie in command, in the captain's chair. I don't know who this relief helmsman is. We've got some extras here who I don't recognize. I don't recognize any extras here apart from Leslie. Kirk and Spock enter the bridge. Leslie takes his position back at helm as Kirk goes to his chair. And Kirk says, activate phaser banks. And Leslie says, phaser banks activated. After a few moments as they pause, Leslie turns to him and says, phaser standing by, sir. And we see the radiation flickering on the planet. Kirk orders the phasers fired. We get a lovely remastered shot of the Enterprise. Probably the only real noticeable one in this episode of it firing on the radiation source on the ship, on the planet. And we see it firing at that ship as the two Lazaruses fight in the corridor, trapped there for all eternity now, and the ship is destroyed. And Kirk leans back in his chair after the situation is now over, and he says, all right, Mr. Leslie, let's get out of here. Warp 1. Leslie acknowledges, Warp 1, sir. And Kirk looks over to Spock and says, everything's all right, Mr. Spock, for us. There is, of course, no escape for Lazarus. And Lazarus, imagine it, trapped forever with a raging madman at your throat. And what of Lazarus? And the episode ends. And it's directed by Gerd Oswald. And when we look at him on IMDb, we can see that he's only directed one other episode, which is The Conscience of the King, which is a way better episode than this. And we then see a shot of the Enterprise leaving orbit of the planet, another remastered effect, which is quite nice. We go into the end credits and we see the guest stars. We start with Robert Brown as Lazarus. We then see Dr. McCoy, played by Dee Kelly, of course. Janet McLaughlin, played Charlene Masters. We've got Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, Richard as Commodore Barstow, Arch Whiting as assistant engineer, Christian Patrick as the naive transporter chief, and Eddie Paskey as Leslie. Leslie gets a mention here for once because he actually was a featured speaking role in this episode. I think that's the first time I've seen him credited. Now, they've misspelled his name here because he's always credited as Leslie everywhere else, and he's spelt the other way here. And something about Leslie, actually, while we're on the subject of him, I'm pretty certain that his name was probably given to him by William Shatner himself, because he does this with another extra in season 3. Leslie is the first name of one of William Shatner's 3 daughters, and I'm pretty certain that that is why Eddie Paskey is called Mr. Leslie. The music for this episode is composed and conducted by Alexander Courage, and let's take a look at the full cast of this episode on IMDb. We've got our usual faces here. We can see Robert Brown there as Lazarus. Now, something that's quite interesting about this casting is that Robert Brown was actually a very, very last-minute replacement for the original actor who was supposed to play the character of Lazarus, but who didn't show up on the first day of filming for reasons that I couldn't find, if they ever got to the bottom of it. The original actor who was supposed to play him was a guy called John Drew Barrymore. And if you're thinking that sounds familiar, then you'd be right. John Drew Barrymore is, or was in fact, the father of Drew Barrymore. So there you have it. Now, Robert Brown, I think, did a pretty good job. I think it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had the original actor taken this role, but it's a weird bit of trivia, that one. Apparently, Robert Brown was a last-minute recommendation by William Shatner. So he obviously had Shatner's trust, and he was brought in. His first day of filming was actually on his 40th birthday. So there you go, a bit of trivia. There we've got Janet McLaughlin there as Masters, and Richard Durr there as Barstow, Arch Whiting as assistant engineer. And if I look at Richard Durr, as I suspected, he did play another Starfleet flag officer, and it was in season 3 in the episode called The Mark of Gideon, where he played on that occasion Admiral Fitzgerald. Final bit of housekeeping for us here today is to give this episode a score. IMDb gives this a score of 5.7, which is one of the very lowest rated episodes of Star Trek, the original series. 5.7 is extremely low, certainly the lowest ranked, I believe, in season 1. I can't really argue with that. I must admit I enjoyed it more rewatching this than I thought I was going to, because this episode is so derided, and for the right reasons, because there are so many ridiculous elements to it, and it's slow-paced and repetitive, and many of our protagonists act like complete and utter doofuses in it and let this Egypt get the better of them when it would have been very simple not to. So I'm going to give it a 5. I think it deserves no more than that. So there you go, another one in the bag. Really not a great episode. Has its moments. It's got some very, very weird quirks in there, like the weird change in engineering personnel and lots of other things that I've already said just don't make a lot of sense. So let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments. Are you a rare defender of this episode, or are you on board with the majority of the fan base who seem to find this one to be one of the very, very least exciting and worthwhile episodes of the original series? Do let me know. Please also give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you would be so kind. I'll let you go now. As ever, I'm going to ask you to take care, stay safe, travel well, and above all else, live well and prosper. Bye-bye.